Hello from Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Perhaps the most controversial person in 20th century literature, and maybe even literature overall, generally speaking, was born in Haley, Idaho in 1885, the son of a mineral assayer from Wisconsin, who became proficient in 9 languages, was fired as a college instructor for harboring an itinerant chorus girl in his on-campus residence, established himself as a leading expatriate poet, critic, and editor for several international literary magazines such as The Little Review and Blast, was the founder of 2 significant modernist movements, served as the initial advocate for a large number of some of the most influential writers of the early 20th century, was the author of 9 volumes of poetry, 20 prose publications, 4 anthologies, a translation of ancient Chinese poetry without even having any real working knowledge of that language, and the writer of 6 sets of cantos, or songs, comprising as many as 116 sections and totaling 23,000 lines of verse, as well as being accused of treason for having made hundreds of radio broadcasts from fascist Italy during World War II, and becoming confined by the U.S. Army for 2 weeks in a 6 by 6 foot open cage outside Pisa, before being committed to a mental institution near Washington, D.C. for approximately 9 years, while also being given a literary award by the United States Library of Congress for a collection of poems, the first lines of which, lamenting the death of Benito Mussolini, had been written on a roll of toilet paper while their author was being held in custody by the American Fifth Army as a war criminal. I mean, of course, Ezra Weston Loomis Pound. In spite of all his achievements and contributions to the careers of such writers as T.S. Eliot, whom Pound nicknamed Possum, James Joyce, D.H. Lawrence, Robert Frost, William Carlos Williams, Marion Moore, and Ernest Hemingway, Ezra Pound himself is most probably remembered for the single 3-word phrase, "make it new," and then, too, for his very frequently anthologized description of people outside a Paris subway. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Without Pound, however, to whom T.S. Eliot dedicated his post-World War I epic poem, The Wasteland, specifically terming his dedicatee the better craftsman, what would have existed in place of that masterpiece as it is known today, including such phrases as "April is the cruelest month," "I will show you fear in a handful of dust," and its time-traveling spiritual journey to the east, "your shadow at morning striding behind you, your shadow at evening rising to meet you, leaving behind the ruined cities of Western civilization in a journey toward enlightenment within the mystic mountains of Tibet," would have been a rambling, prose-like autobiographical poem called "He Do the Police in Different Voices." Also, it was largely thanks to Ezra Pound that James Joyce's Ulysses, which the Modern Library selected as the best novel of the 20th century, made it into print at all. As explained in a 2019 Chicago Tribune article, Ezra Pound's contributions as an international representative for the Little Review made it possible for that publication to secure the work of such writers as William Butler Yeats, Robert Frost, T.S. Eliot, and Hilda Doolittle, who Pound encouraged to publish her poetry simply under the initials H.D. Of course, it was the publication within the little review of a public masturbation excerpt from James Joyce's Ulysses, which Pound had encouraged, that got the magazine's owners, Margaret Anderson and Jean Heap, arrested and tried for obscenity in a case that took over a decade before it was finally resolved by the New York State Supreme Court. What Ezra Pound largely contributed to 20th century literature, however, was an uncompromising commitment to innovation and originality, while also acknowledging and seeking to carry forward the legacy of thousands of years of accumulated cultural tradition. He sought to popularize and reinterpret medieval European troubadours, as well as ancient Greek and Chinese texts, and he's become a kind of literary Rorschach test for the first half of the 20th century, about whom Robert Frost once said, "People who know always end up dragging in Ezra Pound somewhere. He may be named only to be cursed as a wanton and mocker, poser, trifler, and vagrant, or he may be classed as filling a niche today that, like Romantic poet John Keats in the preceding epoch. The point is, he will be mentioned." Pound defined and inspired both imagism, stressing the primacy of the visual aspects within creative writing, and then votricism, setting things into dynamic action, as much as Sigmund Freud or Albert Einstein. Daniel Swift, an associate professor of English at Northeastern University London, has asserted, "Pound invented the modern age," and American critic and scholar Micah Rosenthal has observed, "All the beautiful vitality and all the brilliant rottenness of our heritage in its luxuriant variety were both at once made manifest in Ezra Pound." As early as 1909, Pound had embraced the ideals of Italian futurism, as outlined by Filippo Tommaso Marionetti's manifesto, asserting, "The essential elements of our poetry will be courage, daring, and revolt, and that the poet must exert himself with warmth, brilliance, and lavishness in order to increase the enthusiastic fervor of primordial elements." For what it's worth, what to me seems most interesting with respect to Pound's make it new dictum, more than the word new, is a question of the referent for the pronoun it. Well, given that Pound himself created so many reworkings of ancient and medieval texts, like sections of Homer's Odyssey and the 10th century Anglo-Saxon poem The Seafarer, as well as Chinese poetry and works of medieval troubadours, my sense is that what interested him, at least to some rather large degree, was the updating of things and a commitment to direct treatment of subject matter and, in his own words, the absence of anything that wouldn't contribute to presentation or composition in the form of a musical phrase. Further regarding music, in fact, Pound, working in conjunction with violinist Olga Rudge, helped to bring the work of Antonio Vivaldi, such as the Four Seasons, out of general obscurity, and later to advocate for avant-garde composer and self-proclaimed bad boy of music George Antheil who, after returning from Europe to the United States during the Second World War, would collaborate with Austrian immigrant film actress Hedy Lamarr on the invention of a frequency hopping system for Allied submarines that has come to make today's cell phone technology possible. Then, of course, as described in an extensive biography by Humphrey Carpenter titled A Serious Character, The Life of Ezra Pound, there were also rather intense human complications of a very intricate personal life that were directly intertwined with a host of Pound's specific literary ambitions. For example, when first coming to England in 1909, around the time of the publication of his volume of poetry titled Persona, Ezra Pound began to pursue a relationship with a woman named Olivia Shakespeare, who was some 21 years older than himself, in order to become acquainted through her with her former lover, Irish nationalist poet William Butler Yeats. But then, after becoming Yeats' personal secretary, Pound married Olivia Shakespeare's daughter, Dorothy, instead, who was a year younger than himself and whom he claimed, according to Humphrey Carpenter, to have merely intended to secure as a disciple, finding her, more than anything, a lovely sculpture, a beautiful Galatea that never came to life. Still, it was the income from his wife's family that made it possible for Pound not to need to write for money, even though, after moving to Paris with Dorothy, following the First World War, within the next 3 years, he'd fathered a daughter with violinist Olga Rudge, and learning that his mistress had become pregnant just a year after Benito Mussolini's 40,000 black shirt-wearing Treaty of Versailles aggrieved combat veteran supporters had marched on Rome, and their leader, El Duce, had been asked by King Vittorio Emanuele III to form a fascist government, Mr. and Mrs. Pound had left France for Rapallo, Italy, being followed by Ezra's pregnant mistress, Olga, thereby causing his wife, Dorothy, to return to her mother, Olivia Shakespeare, and then go off on an extended trip to Egypt, from which she, Mrs. Pound, later returned, pregnant herself, in order to attend the opening of her husband's opera in Paris, La Testament de Vedlan, based on the writings of a 15th century poet, that had been developed with composer George Antile, while it was Ernest Hemingway who eventually would take Dorothy to the hospital in order to deliver her son, whose birth certificate Ezra Pound dutifully signed, being the mother's legal husband. And the boy then was named Omar Shakespeare Pound, possibly as an expression of some degree of acknowledgement of the infant's, otherwise known only to Dorothy, biological father, before sending the boy off to be raised by his maternal grandmother, William Butler Yeats' former lover, Olivia Shakespeare. While Olga and Ezra Pound's daughter, Mary, it was arranged, would be raised by a local Italian couple whose own child had recently died, before later being sent off to a convent school and only coming to live with her biological father and mother some 12 or so years later. It was within this context that Ezra Pound wrote his cantos, as well as such works as Jefferson and or Mussolini, promoted the writing of other authors, and became attracted to the social credit economic theory developed by Clifford Hughes Douglas, which Pound, on at least one occasion, during a meeting arranged by Olga Rudge with Mussolini, who, like herself, had been a violinist and also admired the music of George Antheil, personally told El Duce that the Douglas economic system should be placed at the very foundation of his all within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state efforts to make Italy great again. What I think played themselves out for Ezra Pound were a number of differing factors that ultimately led to the slippery slope of his political affiliations. These included admiration for the high achievements of classical civilization, enthusiasm for progress, a high level of disdain for the ordinary mortals who were incapable of understanding his intentions, and a somewhat ambivalent acknowledgement of the notion as expressed within the Futurist Manifesto of war as the sole hygiene of the world, having both expressed disgust at the slaughter of the First World War, which Pound felt to have been caused by the global capitalism of international Jewish financial interests, and had also asserted, as early as within his poems from 1908 to 1911, "May God damn forever all who cry peace, in addition to our acts rise up and judge us." The British novelist and feminist Virginia Woolf had once observed that sometime around December of 1910, human character changed. However, my sense of things is that Pound may have felt a shift in the nature of human life had come somewhat earlier, and not just with the Futurist Manifesto of 1909, but as asserted by the third son of an illegitimately born Austrian customs official, with his third wife, who was also his second cousin, named Adolf Hitler, in a book titled Mein Kampf, My Struggle in English, written while its author had been imprisoned for an attempted insurrection prior to being elected Germany's chancellor in 1933, that the transformation had begun in 1900. Following that fin de siècle turn-of-the-century benchmark date, with the death of Friedrich Nietzsche in quick succession, had come Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, and Cubist attempts to represent three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional plane, as well as, just before the beginning of World War I, the reinterpreted pre-Christian primordial ritual sacrifice of Igor Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, all of which the eventual failed art student German chancellor would condemn as degenerate, but which, like Pound, Benito Mussolini would publicly support. What seems to have, at least initially, attracted Ezra Pound to the fascists was the newness of the ideas of speed and efficiency that had come with the end of the 19th century, pushing aside both Age of Enlightenment 18th century ideals of majority rule and Industrial Age 19th century collectivist Marxist notions regarding the eventual withering away of the state, while embracing the supremacy of a strongman executive leader who viewed ideals about liberté, égalité, and fraternité, as well as, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, as mindless travesties reaching back to the Renaissance power politics of Niccolo Machiavelli, while freeing a largely reinterpreted version of Friedrich Nietzsche's Superman from the shackles of conventional morality and the 2,000-year-long Christian dictatorship of the twice-turned cheek in favor of the rise of an ideology that could transcend individualism to make the world new through hierarchical authority and the supremacy of the state. Fascism, for Ezra Pound, apparently provided the means to the end of making things new as a result of the empowerment of assertive, charismatic, executive order-based leadership. Even after his release from over a decade of confinement, Pound described both Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, according to Humphrey Carpenter's biography, as martyrs, stating in number 74 of the Pisen Cantos, the Library of Congress award-winning publication, that they had each died bravely, in reference to the closing lines of T.S. Eliot's poem The Hollow Men, with a bang, not a whimper. Of course, thanks to his vast erudition and the use of multiple languages, including Chinese calligraphy, actually reading the works of Ezra Pound is a considerable challenge. Yet, his contribution to 20th century literature cannot be denied. In 1967, according to Mr. Carpenter's biography, Ezra Pound told the American poet Allen Ginsberg, author of Beat Generation's anthem of alienated identity, Howl, regarding his various previously held opinions. At the age of 70, I realized that instead of being a lunatic, I was a moron. Still, in spite of everything that can be said about him, without Ezra Pound's influence, the literature of the 20th century would have been profoundly impoverished. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois.